There will have been a lot of thought given to this ceremony today by a lot of different people in order to make sure that it was pitched just right, because there was probably a great danger of it being pitched wrong.
Yes, I think over the last 10 years, really since the peace process has been more or less consolidated, I think we were looking for a centenary that would attempt to include everybody, would allow a sort of complexity, that this happened in the middle of the First World War, when many Irish people had volunteered to fight in the war, that the majority of those who were killed were civilians, that many children were killed, and that there's still an argument about it. I mean, was it a right thing to do? Should we have waited? What should have happened? So I think all the radio programs, television programs, all the journalism, all the historians, and indeed the government and everyone involved have attempted to bring a sort of new narrative to bear on this. So we have to look at it again. But it doesn't. It did happen. It is one of the ways our country came into being. So therefore, we do have to have a day, like every other country does, in which we celebrate and indeed commemorate, and perhaps even interrogate how the Republic of Ireland came into being.
Okay, so there you have the parades in the streets. You've got the different national services marching in time. You've got bands, a cenotaph of sorts. What do you think those few members of that military council 100 years ago would have made of this celebration 100 years later, celebrating particularly what they did and died for?
Dublin's a really cynical city, and people are filled with irony and jokes. It was really amazing today. I was downtown just to watch the way in which, for example, people spontaneously applauded the president as he went by. The way people also, responded to the army and the defence forces with a sort of reverence, with a sort of awe. And I think that would have really surprised the men who thought they were a minority of a minority. They were a small group. They were dreamers. They were poets, some of them. They didn't expect to win. And the idea that 100 years later there would be a state in place, and that state would be treated by its citizens as something that was important, and a day, in commemoration would be considered something you bring children into witness, and that people themselves, whether, for example, there was a minute's silence in honour of all the dead, and people just went completely quiet. And there was a sense of awe, of reverence, and maybe every country needs that.
You mentioned that a couple of times, that every country needs that day of reminding themselves that they exist, that they were established at some point, and perhaps that establishment was difficult. What makes the Easter Rising Day perhaps different is that leaderships on the two extremes of your society, on the Republican extreme and on the Unionist extreme, still feel a large amount of antipathy towards this day.
Yes, it's not like France or America or England or Britain or the United Kingdom. That this still remains contested space, this idea of who owns Irish history, of what Ireland actually represents, which is why this has to be done very, very carefully. It has to be done with some recognition that, for example, there are 1 million people in Northern Ireland who feel British as well as Irish, and that we in the South have to recognise their right to be like that. And on the other side, indeed, we still have the remnants of a group who think that they can shoot and bomb people into a sort of future that nobody wants. So that it isn't as though this is a simple matter. This is a new country, and I think any new country that's come into being. I mean, we weren't a republic until 1949, and our institutions are reasonably new. I mean, they're not fragile, but they're new. And therefore, we don't have a great tradition of this, say, as the French do, or the English do, or the Americans. So it is it is terribly important to get it right.
It's interesting. I mean, there was a Basque delegation there today as well, and that sort of clarifies that, remembering that feeling that this is all about the end of an occupation, and a reminder that the occupier often underestimates and also misunderstands what it's like to be the occupied.
Yeah, I saw Catalan flags there too. I mean, I think any small country or any small nation that has hopes to become a state, or any new state that was a small nation, will look to Dublin today to think, actually, this is an interesting moment in the history of decolonisation.
So Ireland, of course, 100 years ago, a deeply Catholic country, organised in a certain way, with a certain type of society. Now it's a It's a very modern society, it's secular, it's tolerant, it's international. So what kind of message should the people of Ireland take, and the people of Dublin, they're standing in the silence on the roadside, what sort of message should they take from a day like today?
I think that it ends up being citizenship, that this is the country we're from, the country we're proud of, and there was so much talk about the next 100 years and what we need to build. And also, there was an amazing in the afternoon where more than 1,000 people in a choir sang with the poet Paul Muldoon, who had written the music, had written the words, and he was there, he was reciting them. And they really were as much about the future as the past. And I think as a writer, I've written a libretto for an oratorio for next week, and all the writers are taking part, a lot of the composers, some of the visual artists. So there still is a sense in Ireland that idea of poetry, of music, remains at the forefront of our sort of national ourselves. And that, I suppose, is a very important part of the commemoration.
The Rising of 2016 was followed by the best part of 30 years of internal struggle, what you might call civil war in Ireland, which was largely ignored by the English, and is certainly not a part of our kind of education curriculum over here. There's a temptation in England to regard the goings-on in Ireland and such celebrations as being quaint. Given that Scotland is now also going through a certain rethink about its role in the United Kingdom, is there anything the UK or the UK could learn collectively, or indeed the English could learn from what happened in Ireland in terms of how it treats Scotland and perhaps Wales?
Yes, there is. Ireland is so pro-European. We were so proud with Great Britain to join the European Union in 1973. We have benefited from membership not only economically, but also psychologically and culturally, being part of Europe, being part of something much greater, that our Prime Minister can go and have an equal say in Brussels. And so the idea that Britain would consider removing itself from the European Union is for us unimaginable. The idea that, for example, the European Union represents for us a sort of modernity, as it does for other countries, a sort of time of peace. And it's something that Ireland has worked towards consolidating. The Irish Defence Forces have worked so much internationally with the United Nations. We care in Ireland about things like the United Nations and the European Union. So watching what's going on across the water for us is really horrifying. I mean, obviously democracy has to work. I mean, there's no point in saying it doesn't. But I think the majority of Irish people would view the idea of a British withdrawal from the European Union, I think we'll be horrified by it.
Colm Tóibín, pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thanks for joining us here on Sky News.